My name is Jason S.C. Fung, and this is the Vanilla Club podcast. Here we go with our very first repeat guest on the show. Expat Prep, or should I say Senor Expat Prep, someone I've befriended over the months, someone with a great deal of smarts and a wry sense of humor. Today's episode is a return of sorts. We're returning with our guest, and our guest himself is returning to what has become his second home, effectively, Montevideo, Uruguay. Expat Prep is an anonymous Substack writer who's been ensconced in documenting the process of living across borders. We explore what it means to essentially redesign your life when so many of the basic assumptions, all those things that you take for granted, end up coming into question. Expat Prep, he gives us an update about his most recent trip to Montevideo and what has changed since we last spoke. There is background about a shots fired incident. Expat Prep takes us right into the belly of this discussion. And he does it in his usual heavily referenced, heavily footnoted way with plenty of pop culture references. We hope you enjoy. With that, we are live. We are with our first ever repeat guest.
So, which is a tremendous honor. Thank you, Jason.
It's such a pleasure to speak with you, Expat Prep. You know, I think you have this burgeoning readership that, again, there are people who can dive in for different reasons. They do dive in for different reasons. You know, there might be somebody who's specifically looking at a tax problem that they might have, or maybe they're country specific to Uruguay, and some of your in-country knowledge in that specific sense is relevant to them. But for me and for other generalists out there who are, you know, there for the story, right? We're there for the journey. It's just great. It's great. And it's a real pleasure to dialogue with you. Let's just start with, you know, you're back from South America.
Yes.
We've heard about Uruguay. We've heard about Montevideo, Ciudad Vieja.
Right.
Just give us a little bit of background about your trip. How was it?
Oh, well, that's the first thing, unfortunately, because I'm being judicious about not wanting to visibly antagonize our beloved government. The listeners are not going to be able to see how fabulous my suntan from Uruguay is, which is a loss. Because if I ever remotely approach looking, you know, kind of really good, now would be the moment. So the readers will just have to imagine a very suntanned middle-aged tax lawyer, right?
Okay.
The trip was such an interesting thing. The backstory why I'm there is I am now a permanent legal resident of Uruguay. They don't have a hard and fast quantitative numerical number of days requirement to maintain the residency per year of time in country. But the guidance I get from my attorney is that, you know, as they'd say down there, más o menos, the 30 days is good. It's a good guideline. And there is flexibility around that. But I've decided that's good. I'll just make sure I'm in country 30 days a year. For reasons of reducing the disruption to family and work up north, I split that into two segments of roughly 2 weeks and change. And this was the first of the two anticipated for the year. The second one will be in November. It was solo for reasons mostly to do with how Uruguay treats residency for minor children. We are not obtaining residency for my young son right now. We're in a position of optionality to do that if conditions change. But The reason is they want, the child enrolled in school, physically present school in Uruguay. And when you're ready to do that, they're happy for your child to be a resident. But if you're not doing that, it's not the right time. So, for a number of reasons, it was just me down there. The family, as I said, all of us will be back in November. The solo reconnaissance, though, was fascinating, and we can go a lot more into depth to that. But my overall goal on this trip was to experience Uruguay as a resident and not a tourist, and get as granular and as dense and as wide-ranging information and assessment as possible about what it costs and what it feels like and what life would actually be like, because it's easy to fall in love with a fictitious version of a place that's not the way life really is. And I wanted to do the opposite of that. I mostly succeeded, except we can get to the end of the story. I ended up in La Barra for a week around Punta del Este, and that is a real version of Uruguay for some very fortunate people. Um, it's it's amazing. I'm not sure that it's the real Uruguay, but I loved it. And so I'm bringing the wife back to La Barra in November under the hopes that she likes it so much she just wants to keep coming back to Uruguay. It'll make the rest of my life so much simpler if she does.
So, how do you get to Uruguay from most U.S. hubs? Do you fly in through Buenos Aires? You connect there, or Sao Paulo? What is the typical flight connection?
Well, it varies by time of year. There is a direct flight from Miami that runs kind of December through February. That's obviously very convenient to go directly into Montevideo. It just reduces the number of moving parts. Um, the other most common way, or that I've done two other times, is to fly to Buenos Aires direct from the United States. Those flights, there are many of them. There's a good density of flights. You can leave from Houston, Miami, Atlanta, I think also JFK. So there's some good options there. And then once you're in Buenos Aires, I don't know how you describe it. It's sort of the level of hassle that would be involved in getting from Washington, D.C. up to New York. Like it's almost something you could pop over for lunch, but it would
Hmm.
center punch your entire day. You might even, depending on how you're doing it, it's a hassle factor analogous DC to Boston. Like it's meaningful. It's very doable, but and that's both the charm and the features of Uruguay. It is a little harder to get to if you're in Estados Unidos, and that is why perhaps it is. Although there's a very meaningful American presence, and we should talk more about that. It is not overrun, and it's a little bit off the grid. It's off the path, which is a part of its charm.
Absolutely, and it's sort of wedged in there, almost like poised to be a services hub for Argentina, Brazil, for potentially other South American countries too. I mean, how do they perceive themselves?
That's a fascinating question. And I met some people who could speak to that very directly and much better than I ever could. And maybe as your podcast grows, we'll get them on your podcast.
Yeah.
Um, these are very connected investment advisors and attorneys who, because Uruguay is small, it's very relational. And it is extremely much the case that everybody knows everybody else. And the flip side of that is they're astonishingly polite. And when I'm down there, I try very hard to be polite. And I realize as I reflect on all of my conversations after I have them that although I've tried to be superbly polite, I need to up my politeness game to keep up with the
Okay.
Uruguayans. There's just a tremendous premium placed on civility and not being abrupt and being gracious and considerate and taking time to listen to people. The upshot is, I almost feel bashful making grand statements about how they see themselves because I'm very humble about the limits of my qualifications to speak to that. But if we imagine the giant disclaimer dropped before I go there, it's always been about agriculture. It still continues to be massively about agriculture. They have this astonishingly productive sector around cattle and sheep and a range of crops, and the land is productive, and there's a very rich farming tradition. And I would liken it to the farmsteads of the Midwest as opposed to the Great Plains. Like, these are very prosperous, significant scale family farming operations, but they are still fundamentally family. Like, it's not ConAgra. There's a deep family tradition in the agricultural sector. And a lot of people in Montevideo have ties back to the family farm, and they go back there on weekends, and they've got siblings and cousins who are working on the farm. Aside from that, the huge industry, massive industries, construction, because I mean, there's sort of an endless supply, bless their heart, of Argentinians who want a place to put their dollars into something tangible. So if you put up a nice condo, in proximity to the beach in Uruguay, then you can be confident you will find an Argentinian to buy it if you're patient and wait for the right time in Argentina's economic cycle. So the construction industry is massive, and it appears to, not in a bubble way, but in a sustained and and busy and an ongoing way. It's also a very important political lobby that in turn influences the policy of Uruguay's central bank with regard to their managed float against the dollar and other currencies. But I'd also say that the culture of Uruguay is dominated by its proximity to Argentina, but the economy of Uruguay is dominated by its proximity to Brazil. So that's an interesting paradox. There's a pull in two different directions, but it wouldn't surprise me if over the next 20 to 30 years you get a more visible Brazilian influence in the country, because the economic lopsidedness of those two neighbors is just so large. Brazil dominates so massively on that equation.
Population wise, it's like 3 million to 200 million. Yeah. Right. So it's like a 60-1 population edge.
And another way, like with Argentina, you've got 45 million people. In Brazil, you've got well over 200.
Yeah.
So there is historically much more parity between those two nations that are neighboring Uruguay, but there's no parity today. There's only dominance.
But again, there's still a role to be played, right? Whether that's sort of hedging, I mean, Singapore as a great example, right, has carved out, I don't think there's many wealthy Indonesians who wouldn't consider Singapore or some type of asset management that had Singapore feature into that mix somehow or the other, right? And I'd imagine Uruguay would aim to position itself. It's much smaller, but that can be an advantage.
It is.
In some ways.
And they very much they're very comfortable with their role as a capital haven and as a physical haven, and they lean into that, and they're fine with it. Now, of course, much like the Swiss, and they're likened to the Switzerland of South America, the Swiss have a lovely nation, and they attract a tremendous amount of capital. One of the price tags of that is that the price level in Switzerland is high compared to its neighbors. And you get that same dynamic in Uruguay. It's very common in the international space, in the expat space, people keenly aware about size of geo arbitrage advantages. And I'll be totally forthright. Under that scorecard, Uruguay is not strong. It is perceptibly less expensive than the American Midwest, but across the entire consumption basket, and we can go into more detail if that's of interest to you on the details of the consumption basket, but across the whole thing, on your best day, I think you have a 20% delta compared to the American Midwest, which means compared to the American coasts, it's dramatically cheaper, but it is probably a solid 20 to 25% more expensive than Argentina. So for people who are looking to really optimize geo arbitrage, you would not choose Uruguay. In return for being willing to put up with the price level, you get a very orderly, harmonious, cohesive society with a remarkable provision of social welfare. And, it's a pleasant place to live, a stable place to live. If you were raising a family, or if your young child was going to grow up to make that their lifelong home, they would not feel as if they had to live inside a gated compound in order to have a worthwhile life. It's a broadly egalitarian and very well-functioning society, but it is, on a regional basis particularly, it's a high-cost society.
So I guess, yeah, that's where defining some of our terms might be helpful. In terms of the geo arbitrage, it seems like you could be talking about the same thing with people, but you scratch the beneath the surface and people are optimizing for different things.
Right.
Right. And again, your own personal safety threshold might vary between certain people. If you factor in certain ethnic affinities, right? If we were talking about Israel, everything else, physical danger, difficulty, inconvenience of flying around, inability to travel to neighboring countries, those wouldn't be a factor, right? The geo arbitrage, looking at it from an ethnic lens, I'm optimizing for being close to my people, right? So let's just talk about that geo arbitrage. Are you speaking about it from a sort of narrow, just literally a cost?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. When I was speaking in the last several minutes, I meant strictly cost.
Okay, strictly cost. Okay, yes.
Who is making, their choice of alternate location strictly on cost will not be likely to choose Uruguay.
Okay. Yeah. So strictly on cost, you hedged by also saying that, again, compared maybe to New York or Miami or LA or San Francisco, even from a strict cost standpoint, there's a margin there.
Oh, yes.
Right. I would imagine.
But in a way that's not fair, because you'd have to introduce the concept of domestic geo-arbitrage, right? Like, if you're being a wise guy, you could say you could capture the first 70% of the cost delta you get from moving from San Francisco or New York to Uruguay. The first 70% of that cost delta, at a minimum,
you could go to
is achievable by moving to fly over America. So, which is a lot easier to do.
Got it. So then the attractiveness arises from other factors. It's markedly safer than a Sao Paulo or Mexico City, or
I haven't spent direct time in those countries, so I want to be cautious about that. And I can just speak to my own experience. If we were getting all nerdy economist about it, I feel like the Gini coefficient, that whole measure, that measure of inequality, is much lower in Uruguay, much lower than in other Latin American countries. It also scores very highly on various human development index type rankings. And if you use those as proxies for where is there a broad-based healthy middle class, and where is it safe and pleasant to live, even if you are not an oligarch, then Uruguay scores very well.
Then I guess
put some hard numbers on it, Jason, which might be interesting for your listeners. There's a version of a dignified and comfortable and pleasant life in nice surroundings up around Colonia, which is right across the Rio de la Plata from Buenos Aires, beautiful historic town, that a family of 3 or 4 could do on, call it $55,000, $60,000, $65,000 a year. That would be, you definitely would not own 2 cars. If you owned a car, it would be a single little car, and you wouldn't really have fully solved for the independent school equation. But other than that, you just have a really, really, really nice life. If you pivot and you want to build more of like an international expat flavored life up around Punta del Este, that might be $100 to $110,000 a year USD. And on top of that, you would be stacking private school tuitions at approximately, approximately $20,000 per year per kid. On one level, those sound like really high numbers, but the Colonia thing is probably $35,000 a year less than a comparable lifestyle would be in the United States, in the Midwestern United States. And you have a really astonishing intangible quality of life. And up around Punta, it begins to be a little pricier. No one would claim that that's a low amount of money for your average family to live on per year. But the level of niceness, you'd have to be spending minimum 2 and potentially 4x in the US to get something as nice. So I think this is it's trite, but I sort of decided during my time there that there are many different Uruguays, and people who are approaching it from different walks of life, different stages of life, different budgets, different goals. Even though it's a relatively little country and it's allegedly kind of dull, I found it not dull at all. And sort of Walt Whitman-esque, it contains multitudes. Like there's many different ways somebody could design a life there. It's not one size fit all.
That's really interesting. So if we just have a sort of fact book overview snapshot, I mean, would it be, I've been to Buenos Aires a couple times. If you sort of popped me into a Montevideo cafe and then somehow teleported me back to Buenos Aires, would I notice a marked difference?
That's a really interesting question. And the broad answer is, and I'll get into the snark in a minute, because you'd notice a little bit of difference, and we could talk about that. And the Argentines would have their opinions about the difference, and the Uruguayos would have their opinions, and the North Americanos would have their opinions. Everyone will have opinions about this. But attempting to be relatively factual before I turn snarky, there are neighborhoods in Montevideo that have clear equivalents to similar neighborhoods in Buenos Aires. For instance, the whole kind of Ciudad Vieja would be analogized to the San Telmo area in BA. There's a historic architecture, more of a traditional Latin American architectural vernacular. It's a little bit scrungy. It's a little bit touristy. It's a little bit like, like the French radicals from the 1960s are in a time warp, complete with like the dinky little 4-cylinder old cars. It's a really cool vibe. And also, the people who are prosperous in each of the two cities will think you're going to get stabbed if you go to either of those neighborhoods. If we pivot and think about like a Positos neighborhood in Montevideo, that would feel a lot like a Palermo, but much like the difference between, say, a Philadelphia and a New York. And that might be a fair comparison, right? Because they're both really top tier cities, but there are differences of scale. So the size of any given particular neighborhood in Montevideo that will analogize to a BA equivalent, it's smaller. There's not as much of it. And although there's tons to do in Montevideo, the scale of the city is probably 1/3, maybe 1/4 as much going on BA. There really is a qualitative difference of scale. There are certain parts of Montevideo and indeed of Uruguay that I have not found a comparable feeling in Argentina, and mostly because the nature of beaches in Argentina is just different. So this idea of a ridiculously nice, low-slung, beach-oriented suburb, of which there are many in Uruguay, I haven't found that analogy in BA. Now, as to the snarky differences, I think that the trade deficit or surplus, like in other words, the national current accounts of Uruguay would be dramatically improved if they got rid of their graffiti problem, because unless there is a spray paint factory that's in Uruguay, they're having to import all the spray paint and they just, I mean, good Lord, they never found a wall that they didn't want to cover. There is a unusual graffiti or street art function in Montevideo. I found my reaction to that changing. The first time I visited Montevideo, it creeped me out because in the United States, if you are in a very heavy graffiti neighborhood, that's highly correlated with a dangerous place. And there's a bunch of other correlates of that neighborhood that mean it's not a place you want to be, it's a place you want to get out of as rapidly as possible. But the more time you spend in Montevideo, you realize it's just graffiti. It's not the thin end of the wedge. It's not correlated with 10 other neighborhood attributes that make the place dangerous. It's just a different societal preference for having paint on the walls or not. So, but that's a cultural difference because in BA, there's some graffiti, but like an order of magnitude less. There's also a level of pretension to greatness in BA. It's kind of like BA never quite got the memo that it's it's not Milan, or it's not actually literally Paris, or that
Uh,
there's been like 10 financial crises and the creditors need to be repaid. There's this delightful obliviousness about the fact that although they are an incredible city, they might not actually literally be the center of the world. And that can either be maddening or it can be kind of glorious to be in the middle of a city that believes in itself so much. Whereas
mm.
in Montevideo, they don't have that grand self concept. They're a little more grounded and they just see themselves as a more regular city.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. So the sort of background, like if you think about Argentina, they got a lot of Italian waves of migration, I think in the 20s and 30s, and you've got little flourishes of diversity, intra-country diversity that may not be as apparent to certain outsiders, but when you travel there, you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then they've got the whole sort of Germans who, all have
Yes.
interesting papers who arrived, in.
Well, now in truth, just in fairness, some of them have an interesting 1940s origin story, but the truth is that the great center mass of the German community in Argentina predated that particular time.
Definitely, yes. There's no doubt about that. And again, I just forgive me. I extended a little bit of your snark
Yeah, no, it's
into
all
my
good. It's all
comments.
good.
But I'm just curious about like Brazil it's sui generis. One of your preferred, one of your many terms that you like to use. I mean, in so many different ways. It's this Atlantic, and also it's different in that it's Portuguese, and then they've got these pockets because they're also so big and they have this scale. You have 1 million Japanese Brazilians
Right,
in Sao Paulo,
right.
and you have these very interesting little pockets here that, again, wow, you don't fully realize. But then you travel there and then you realize, oh wow, there's so many more nuances. And it goes back to your point too about the multitudes.
Well, it does, and I stand by my multitudes comment, but yet I think you're onto something, Jason, or it just needs to be encountered in a spirit of honesty. If there is a completely polyglot sort of rainbow version of Uruguay from like the different ethnicity perspective, I have not yet encountered it. There's an interesting cultural tributary of like kind of like an Afro Uruguayan thing that's not tremendously large in number. It's overwhelmingly a mashup of Spanish and Italian that is just with a little bit of an old school Anglo, like, sort of residual English presence, thoroughly diluted, a little bit of German, but meaningfully less than Argentina, a
Mm.
little bit of Swiss, kind of interestingly enough. But the center mass of the place, the overwhelming center mass, is going to be Spanish ex-Italian. And the tremendous diversity you were referencing in Brazil, which I haven't been to Brazil, but based on everything I've read and heard, I think it's a true thing. And even in Argentina, although the dominant culture is this same mashup of Spanish and Italian, there are more kind of visible enclaves from worldwide ethnicities in Argentina, with the upshot that that Uruguay is, compared to its neighbors, I think a meaningfully more homogenous society.
So in Australia, our reference point to some of the major cities in Asia is this sort of 9-hour flight, right? It's 8+ hours to Hong Kong. It's 9 hours to Shanghai.
I had no idea it was that far, Jason. Shame on me, but it would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's not. And I think once you live in Australia, you realize that there's just no sense in complaining about this stuff. It just becomes a part of life. I mean, it's to go from Sydney to Perth is 5 hours, right? So
Right.
it just is what it is. But the point I wanted to make, though, is that because of our geographic position, essentially as a hemispheric mirror of like almost like China, we don't have a big time difference. It's only 2 hours, right?
Right.
So for me, I'll say the very fact that you don't suffer jet lag going from Hong Kong to Australia, it totally changes the perception of distance.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you if I placed that question back in your Western Hemisphere, do those dynamics apply?
I think 100% they do. It's been fascinating for me to do the recurring travel north and south and be on a plane for so long and get off the plane and not be wiped out and just have a normal day. And it's paradoxical because it makes it seem so easy and honestly dramatically easier. And you don't need to build kind of 2 days on either side of your trip to just be wiped out by jet lag. And it's extraordinary. It accentuates the difference of the seasons because you get off the plane and you feel fine and you're completely inappropriately dressed and you're either shivering or you're sweating or whatever, but you get over that. And that's a fun problem to have. But it can be a little disorienting. But the other paradox is that even if you're flying from Miami to Montevideo direct, it's 8.5 hours, which at least for a wussy like me feels like a long time on an airplane. And it's that paradox of it's almost close enough to be no big deal, but there's something that is qualitatively different about a 4-hour plane flight versus a 9.5 hour flight. And so there's a paradox where simultaneously it feels very close and very distant all at the same time. And I will, just if we're going to laugh about things, the allegedly intelligent middle-aged person who arrives in the Southern Hemisphere for the first time and begins to catalog all of the obvious differences like a ditwit, like the moon does its phases on the other side. And when you look at Orion, he's upside down. And that the first week and a half I was down there, I was perpetually disoriented because my instinctual sense of north, south, east, and west based on the position of the sun, I was always wrong. Like the sun is high at midday in the northern sky, right? This is like, and once you get used to it, it's no big deal. And once you know what to look for, you're like, wow, I'm surrounded by a bunch of evidence that I live on a round planet after all. And, it's really special to see the Southern Cross for the first time. It is, these are all like, to me, there's a sense of wonder being in the Southern Hemisphere. And I feel really connected to people from the 16th, the 17th, the 18th centuries who were from Western civilization. I don't want to say discovering it because that's annoying because the people there already knew about it, but who were from one culture encountering this for the first time. There is a tremendous sense of wonder, and there's a residual sense of wonder, like things that like it's perfectly ordinary to be surrounded by all these gorgeous birds who never stop squawking, but you kind of learn to love them anyway. And then, you're driving around for days and days and days, thinking you need to be careful of deer crossing the highway late at night. But you realize that's not a problem. It's never going to be a problem. There are no deer. And it's just, so it's fun. It's fun for the jackleg from the Northern Hemisphere to discover all this stuff.
I'm a believer that to be a traveler, I mean, we're tourists sometimes, but there are times where we want to travel. I think for me, the difference is it's some of the unexpected encounters that you have when you travel. Tourism is about a defined experience. I've gone to TripAdvisor. This is a Michelin star restaurant. It's 1 star. I know who the chef is. I've researched the menu. This is what they say, and I pay the money, and this is the type of experience I get. But what you're referring to, I think, is you need to have a bit of, there should be a bit of whimsy in this, I mean, it's like, it is a remarkable thing. You're going to another hemisphere, geo arbitrage be damned, right? I mean,
right.
Let's acknowledge that.
I found, and this, maybe it's the most impossibly trite thing in the world, and feel free to laugh at me after the podcast wraps up, and it's okay. Maybe I deserve to be laughed at. But one of the themes for me on this trip down there, because I was solo, which is a little rare, it was Ferris Bueller-ish, like, in that you never know what could happen if you just walk up and start talking to people, not in like a creepy or weird way, but with more of an openness to just having conversations and seeing where they go. And I reflected that by the time I left Uruguay after 2 weeks, I had met 30 people. And I'm not talking like, 3 minutes. I'm talking like we'd shared meals, or we'd gone to church together, or we'd played golf together, or we'd done like, we had done an asado together, or had extensive meetings together. And, if the measure of you've met somebody is you've got their WhatsApp, then I'd met 30 people. And, I'm not some like monster kind of Malcolm Gladwellian connector. I think it says something about the friendliness of Uruguayans, something about that I was, at a position of openness and kind of serendipity, but it's a special thing. It felt very much like freshman year of college, like sort of freshman fall, where everybody's showing up and nobody knows each other, and really anything could happen. And the social thing is so incredibly fluid. It was unusual and very interesting that way.
So give us a few vignettes of some of these people in this 30-person WhatsApp group. Give us a snapshot of that overlaid with the expat community in Uruguay.
And the juxtaposition is fascinating. I mean, I'll just describe, and for any of those people that I'm about to describe without identifying names, like, I'm doing this from a position of appreciation and affection and really, and really gratitude. And there's no snark, but these people may not realize how colorful and unusual they are. So if I call attention to that, it's a compliment. But it ranges from a guy who's 26, who's like a video production engineer, who is an Anglo-Uruguayan who kind of lost his language. Like, if he writes down his name, looks like an English name, and he speaks English a little bit because he learned it in school and heard little bits and pieces of it from his grandfather, but he's fully assimilated into Uruguay, but he gets baptized into the Anglican Church and then flies off to go be a video production guy in Spain. And like, that's random as hell. And then it's a guy old guy who fled, he fled Uruguay during the dictatura in the 70s and 80s and went to Sweden, of all places, to be a political refugee. And when the situation normalized, he came back. And so he speaks English, and he speaks Swedish, and he speaks Spanish. There's stubbornly refuses to admit he speaks even a little bit of English, like just completely recalcitrant. I am not going to be bilingual. But nonetheless, he's an Anglican priest in Uruguay who has spent most of his life around the old meatpacking town of Fray Bentos, but finds himself in charge of like the Anglican Church in Montevideo. There's really delightful, wonderful people connected with the British school in Montevideo, which you could liken to like the mashup of Choate meets Andover meets Exeter meets Harvard meets Yale of Uruguay, all thrown into one with this incredibly cohesive alumni network. And these people have shaped their lives around physical fitness and sport. And the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Carrasco. And it's like, you know, mens sana and corpora sano for life. And so they're all like suspiciously fit and very friendly and very bilingual and all doing wonderful things. And, you know, whether that's in law or finance or social service or not for profits, they're just really top tier people who are like disturbingly, stupidly good at squash. Just for me, like humiliating to get wrecked at a level in squash that I just, you know, I'm a physically fit person. I'm not like a, you know, an incompetent kind of ditwit. Well, I felt that way. I mean, it just, good Lord. Um, as to the American expats, I mean, that was maybe some of the most fascinating stuff ever. Like, if I think I'm leaning into the whole international thing, these people are making me look extremely junior varsity. They've moved their families, they've gone whole hog, they've completely relocated, they went from 0 to 60 very quickly. They're making big decisions and big moves, and they're living large and they're living great. And they're also much less risk averse than I am. Whereas I'm kind of like, you know, I have to have food not only for the entire Antarctic winter before I go down to the big ice, but I want to have like kind of 3 winters worth of supplies in case, you know, I can't get out. And they're kind of like, hey, man, I'll do this and I'll have half a winter's worth of food and I'll find some seals when I'm down there. I'm good to go. And I'm not being literal, but I'm just like the amount of economic bubble wrap that people require around their lives before they make a big move. You know, there's me, and then there's people who are like 1/3 to 1/10 this risk averse, you know, like less risk averse than I am. So meeting those people was amazing. I ended up having this fascinating conversation in the middle of a eucalyptus forest, surrounded by beautiful modern architecture and very photogenic young children, with this extremely upper crust British guy who had been himself educated, I think, at Cambridge for a university, and before that, he was at Ampleforth College, which is the Catholic public school in Britain. And then after Cambridge, he had done what he described as homeschooling. I thought, you know, I had some sort of Jane Austen thing, like, oh, that's cool. A bunch of families got together and like made a little school pod. That's cool. Tell me about that. And it became clear that no, he was the teacher for like a family's children in one home. And it became sort of more and more apparent that he might have provided educational services to people that were the subject of like, you know, sanctions from the Treasury Department. We don't, you know, very, very interesting. And I'm not going to say more because he's wonderful and he's amazing and there's no need to say more. But his service to these sort of families had caused him eventually to land around Punta. And once he was there, he saw how education was being done, and he got a bunch of innovative ideas about how he wanted to do it. And he connected with some really high capacity funders who wanted to put some muscle behind his vision. And the result was this incredible school. And we were having the most natural conversation you could ever expect, including like the way that he was a 21st century version of Endicott Peabody, who had founded Groton back in the day in the United States. And he liked that. He was flattered by that. But it was so ordinary to be having this conversation. And yet there was nothing ordinary about it at all, because there's a British guy and an American guy, and we're standing in the middle of a eucalyptus forest in Uruguay talking about the international migration flows of ultra high net worth people to Uruguay. Like, it's both ordinary and it's completely crazy what's happening. And I met people too that were like, if I'm politically aware and I'm politically concerned and I'm worried about things in the United States, which I am, these people made me look complacent. They were very worried and they had made major moves very quickly convinced under a sense of urgency. Some of those were in the expat community around Punta. I also connected with a number of people in the LGBTQ and kind of extended set of life situations community around Montevideo. And that was very humbling to be close and relational with people who face such a heightened sense of risk as it relates to something as simple as what the name and gender shown on their passport is, and the ambient concern that if they travel through the wrong passport entry lane to the United States, their passport will be confiscated and they'll be trapped. So my point is, it really, I was in many Uruguays. I was in the Uruguay of the oligarchs. I was in the Uruguay of people who are making it happen off of digital nomad visas and no money at all, and everything in between. It was actually really a privilege to be allowed to observe and listen and learn from all these people.
How much of this trip was pre-planned, and how much of it was one thing? I landed, I met one person, and then one thing led to another.
I'd say half and half. Like, the broad architecture was, I'm going to be in Uruguay for X time, and I'm going to split my time between Colonia and Montevideo. And I knew I'd be having 3 or 4 meetings with some people I was being introduced to by my lawyer that connected with some consulting and academic work I'm doing. But other than that, there's a lot of unstructured time. One thing, and I've referenced this on my Substack, there was my perception of safety issue in Ciudad Vieja regarding the late night gunfire in proximity to my Airbnb unit, about which my Airbnb landlord thought that I was just delusional and this couldn't possibly have happened. And I had the sound recordings that suggested that no, it had actually happened. And so it was fine. We worked it out. But what was so fun is that one of, these American expats up in Punta that I had met in person only 1 or 2 days before, because I'd posted a note on Expat Prep and she'd reached out and said, "Hey, I'm coming down to the airport. Let's meet in Carrasco." And more on that in a moment. But it just it had me pivot unexpectedly up to the expat world of Punta for a week. I'm so glad I discovered it. Feel a little guilty about how easy and fun and congenial it is to be up around Punta. It's pretty magical. But what I also discovered is, and this is, I'm not necessarily proud of it, but I need to be honest about it. There's a tremendous loneliness function being new overseas, just kind of profound. And in ways nobody expects, when you have the opportunity to speak English with someone who's a native English speaker who grew up in your country and watched your movies and TV shows and enjoys your sports and appreciates your movie quotes and references, and even kind of listen to the same music growing up. There's such an incredible comfort that comes from being around at least some of those people some of the time, that there was an openness on the expat community to talking and connecting and being in relationship with each other. And honestly, although I need to choose my words carefully, the social breadth between nodes of the American expat community is so broad. You've got very wealthy people who are living in golf communities, and you've got very not wealthy people who are finding ways to make it happen in the LGBT, in the LGBT community. There's everything in between. But if we were all in North America, all these people would not be people who thought they had something in common with each other. But when we're in Uruguay, it's like, hey, no, we need to talk to each other. Let's hang out. Let's do stuff. So there's a density and a rapidity and a fluidity and an openness to the expat interactions that took me by surprise. But for people who have more extensive overseas experience like yourself, I'm sure it's not surprising at all. It's just sort of the way it is.
Well, I think my guess would be that just because of, you mentioned the word scale, I think there's an interesting phenomenon probably when you have again, it's not a small country by global standards, but relative to Argentina, relative to Brazil,
it's small. It's small.
It's small, right? There's almost, it's at a scale where you can almost capture the breadth of the country in that sort of expat community. Whereas, let's say you're in Brazil, you might have a little community in Belém, you might have one in Salvador, you'll have one in Sao Paulo, and they're doing their own thing. You have sort of some semblance of a similar thing, but the geography, the topography, it's a wholly different situation. So my guess would be that it actually heightens the expat experience, that you can take in almost one breath the entire expat community in this little microcosm.
That's really true. And the entire country is functionally drivable one end to the other in 4 hours. Mm-hmm. So it's just false to say that in 2 weeks, if you're judicious about where you spend your time, you can really get a sense of the whole thing. But it is different than the United States. It's different than China. It's different than Australia. There's not a tyranny of distance. And there's also kind of 1 degree of separation. I mean, everybody knows everybody. So I think you're absolutely right, Jason. I think you're onto something big time.
There's something to be said about that. And I think the matrix of those experiences, it must create this dynamic where everything's just sort of like laid out in a smorgasbord that in fact you can kind of make sense of. So the Gulf community, wealthy, ultra high net worth person is sitting across the table sharing a burrito from the person that, is in many different ways somewhat dispossessed or disadvantaged. And they have this common thread that would not sustain them, if they were in said Midwestern city. But here you are in this context, and it seems so natural, right? I mean, it must be kind of a almost out of body experience, to experience that for the first time.
It is. It's really interesting. Being outside the United States provides a lot of heightened clarity about what Americans have in common with each other. And that's the paradox, right? Like, we live in this age of ridiculous polarization here in the States. Insane polarization and antagonism. And all we can focus on is what we don't like about each other. But when you're overseas, suddenly the perspective really shifts. And maybe there'll be aspects of people that you're thinking, well, I'm not doing a bear hug around 100% of this, but I sure do like talking about, I don't know, like movies from the 90s that we both remember. Let's just do that, right? So, it's good.
Yeah, definitely. So there's something to be said about scale. I think that kind of is a thing lurking there, that it's sort of like to become an expat in Brazil or in China or somewhere else. I think there is something that's fundamentally different from identifying something that has more structural pressure to become community oriented.
Yes.
Right? And it's so interesting that that you've arrived at, it's like Uruguay, because in many ways it seems small. For some people it's like, oh, is it too small? Like you mentioned about the sort of social fabric, that, oh, maybe it's not as interesting, maybe it's not as much fun as BA or other places. But there is something zero sum about that, right? That you're trading some more readily accessible community to a broader set of potential social experiences, maybe.
Maybe, yes. I'd phrase it a little differently, although I think we're pointed in the same direction, Jason. And it's that I've spent not as much time in BA as in Uruguay, but considerable time in BA. And although it's amazing, right? I mean, I think that anybody listening to this would be well advised to go spend a lot of time in BA and enjoy themselves and learn and watch and observe, and it's great. I'm not sure that the serendipitous possibilities to end up meeting people are the same. Um, I'm not being fair to Uruguay in this comparison, but what if you spent like 2 weeks in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, or you spent 2 weeks in Manhattan, right? Like, if a couple of the dominoes land the right way in Cedar Rapids, then by the time you leave 2 weeks later, you'll feel like you know 5% of the city. There's no way that would happen in New York. Another metaphor I'd use is, if people are magnets, and we've all seen like there's weak magnets and strong magnets. And if you just imagined like a whiteboard with magnets that could move around, there are fewer magnets on Uruguay's whiteboard if you're an American or an expat, but they're more strongly charged. Like when you run across another magnet, you're more likely to actually connect and have something happen. So there's a smaller number of people to interact with, but there's an incredible richness and density and intensity to the interactions. And if you go back to the like the idea of Dunbar's number, which is, it's like 100 or 125 people in a tribe or in an infantry company, or a small to medium enterprise is the largest number of people that you can kind of keep track of. It's a number for a scale of a community that feels human to people. I think you're going to build your 125 people in Uruguay pretty great. I think you could build it pretty quick. And if there's not the potential to have 15 different 125 person groups, that's not really relevant because you're only going to be part of one of those groups anyway. Just a thought.
So, what's your temperature now that you've done the trip, you've come back, and most importantly, you've had a chance to take stock of the experience?
Yeah, a couple things. It made me think a lot about money and how Americans spend money, because there's a lot less money in Uruguay, right? Um, their average per capita income is maybe 35 or 40% of that of the United States on a purchasing power parity level. But they are definitely more than 40% as happy as we are. Like, it's more than 40% of as nice a place to live. So it made me think about efficiencies in how people convert money into happiness, and how in the United States, I don't wish to be negative, but just being factual, we don't do a good job of being stewards of the marginal conversion of money into happiness. Like, we don't do that well. The second thing is, I thought a lot about public goods and why can Uruguay be as nice as it is when it has meaningfully less money than we do. And whatever public good you name in Uruguay, whether it's universities or it's public parks or it's bus stations or it's healthcare or it's just the general level of public spaces, or the invisible ambient expectations of public orderliness, it has a very high level of public goods. You could say much, much higher than the United States. I'm still trying to figure out why that would be. But what I took away from that is, if you live in a society where you don't have to privately repurchase everything, because there are actually public goods that are high quality that, the broad population uses, life becomes radically less expensive while still being very nice. So those are two big things I noticed. And the third is just completely superficial, which is that I totally fell in love with the beaches around Punta del Este, and I want to spend as much time there as possible. So in order to deal with my sadness at leaving Uruguay, the last day I was there, I devoted a lot of time to making all the booking arrangements for my next trip to go back in November. And that was really cool, because this whole project started because of concern about the authoritarian drift in the United States. And Uruguay was originally just sort of like, look, it's a solution. I'm grateful for it. I'm not going to dig too hard. It is what it is. So it started as a refuge, but now it's a magnet. I loved it there. And in a world where the 79-and-a-half-year-old man who is progressively senile meets an actuarial end state, and this episode of American political life comes to an end, then I am still going back to Uruguay, 100%. I really like the place, and I'm so grateful and so excited to have that switch flip where, I discovered it for reasons of politics, but the reasons I'm going to keep coming back, they have nothing to do with politics and everything to do with it being a really, really special place.
When you have a new reader, right, who encounters Expat Prep, and you've essentially got to induct them, right? You're inducting them.
And would that involve hazing?
I don't know. You
do we make them conjugate Latin and
make them conjugate Latin?
If they don't post an interesting comment that uses the phrase marginal utility in a non-ironic way, then they're not allowed to subscribe.
That, or I was just, thinking 90s movie trivia with the penalty for wrong answer of, varying amount of volts. Something like that.
Yes. So, if they show appropriate affinity for the Austin Powers movies and for the Bond canon and, the Bourne movies, then they can subscribe at a reduced rate.
I love it. I'm all about that. I'm ready for any of that trivia. So I think.
But I'm sorry, I diverted your question.
No. My question is about the induction of a new reader. So someone has some type of stimulus. There's some trigger that causes some search for information or trying to place themselves in this pantheon of this discussion, the prospective expat discussion. So I'm just curious as to how this, because you talked about this change from the refuge to the magnet, right?
Yeah.
And how you would induct a new reader, let's say 6 months ago, right? Like talking them through a few things, like pointing out some of your sort of landmark articles that you've written. Has that changed at all? If you were talking to somebody who was thinking about this, they maybe hadn't traveled very much overseas or had, second language exposure growing up, where would you begin the conversation with them today as opposed to Expat Prep 6 months ago or when you started the project?
Great question, Jason. It doesn't have a simple answer, but things that come to mind that I'd emphasize are, and they're not new. We've talked about them on Expat Prep, but I might center them and emphasize them differently. One would be the idea of the scouting trip. And this starts with reconnaissance, right? And a lot of people travel, like a lot of Americans travel. They traveled before the Trump administration and they'll travel afterwards. But they were doing it as tourists, to your point, right? And that can be really fun and you can learn a lot. And I'm not running it down. I'm not going to criticize it. But a scouting trip is a fundamentally different orientation than being a tourist. Because in a tourist, you're trying to have a cool experience. And why not? That's fun. But for a scouting trip, you're trying to get as realistic an impression of what it would be like for you with your own particular proclivities and the way you want to live in this place day to day. And that's going to change the kind of neighborhoods where you stay. It's going to change the sort of things you look to do when you're there. And I guarantee, I've done a fair amount of international travel as a tourist. I've never ended up meeting and connecting with people in the same way I did on this trip. You'll have such a different experience, and in many ways, so much better if you approach it from a scouting trip lens. And then that shades into the expatriation thing. And look, a lot of people are approaching this issue with a lot of urgency, and that urgency is fairly taken, and the world is at a very concerning place right now. And I don't want to talk anybody into a standpoint of, I think you're overreacting. But people still, they end up viewing it as a binary thing. They're staying or they're going. They're going quickly or they're going slowly, or, you know, and I've written about this. It's not leaving, building a second home. And maybe it's just my professional experience or the narrow slice of life in Midwestern America that I've lived, but a lot of people, second homes, they have them up in Michigan, they have them down in Florida, they have them in South Carolina, and they get to be in their 40s and 50s and 60s, and they don't officially leave their Midwestern cities. They just spend more and more time in these second homes. And it doesn't feel like a binary cut point. It doesn't feel like a stark choice. It's a natural progression. But if they ever had to leave their particular Midwestern city, they wouldn't be refugees. They would just dial up the amount of time they spend in the place where they're already spending time. And I'm very fortunate and feel very lucky that that is what Uruguay is becoming for our family, is a place we know, a place we like, a place we know people, we know places, we have affinities, we have relationships, we have connectivities, and we like spending time there, and we're going to spend time there. And if conditions in our life change or seasons of our life change where we spend a lot more time there, it doesn't feel disjunctive. It doesn't feel panicked. It doesn't feel like some big emotional expatriation decision. It's just sliding the slider a little bit on how you're allocating your time. So I guess I'd leave readers with, the decision doesn't have to be as fraught and fearful and as binary as a lot of people may feel when they start doing the Google searches that cause them to land on my site or on other related sites. And that the best, most calming and empowering way they can approach this is to not feel a sense of panic. And although the tempo of the news headlines is so bad and so rapid right now, if you just consistently and persistently identify it, go and scout some potential second homes, find one you like that works not only for reasons of emotional connectivity, but also practicalities like visas and so forth. And then just get to work consistently and persistently in ways that are meaningful to you in building and deepening your second ties to this place. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It can just really be something that enriches your life.
I think that's really well put. And I think for people who are trying to frame this in some type of decision matrix, that's a great place to start. It's a great place to start. Like I mentioned Israel earlier. And again, because we are in the shit of it in the Strait of Hormuz right now, it's a very precarious situation for a lot of different reasons. It's very interesting to juxtapose Israel with Dubai vis-a-vis this conversation, because to me, those two places are diametric opposites in terms of who they draw, in terms of this potential expat situation. Even though if you take Aliyah as a Jew to go to Israel, I mean, you're never an expat, right? But for the purposes of this discussion, the idea is placing yourself outside of the US to another place for a certain package of reasons, right? Israel is an example where it is done almost, it's mission based, right? It's at the level of a mission and a lot of other things in terms of even personal safety, right? Certainly convenience is placed way down the list. Now you juxtapose that with Dubai. Dubai is actually 180 degrees from that, where it's literally the inverse of the mission. It is the most convenient. It's the most sort of serendipitously attractive place that, attracts a sort of cornucopia of various people. It's exciting. There's new stuff happening at the same time, but there's no pretense of establishing roots in that community. Right. So I just wanted to throw those two examples as, in my view, those are two poles in terms of the shape of potential places that one could put themselves in terms of what you optimize for in this decision matrix.
Right.
And it's interesting. Like I would suppose that Uruguay would sit somewhere in between those, right? Obviously, convenience is going to be it's going to factor in some way. Security is going to factor in some form or fashion, right? How it is, the food, all of this type of thing, how you get along with people, the local culture, those are going to be factors, right? So I guess my question is really like, how much does culture matter?
Oh boy. I think to answer that question, the most relevant answer to that question in a Uruguay context is the entire Punta del Este phenomenon. Punta is incredible. I'm speaking now of the region, not just the towers on the peninsula. Punta, in a way, is very Uruguayan, but very not. It's actually like so Argentinian there that you see posters on billboards for Argentinian politicians. That's something I literally saw. That's unusual, right? Like I'm in a foreign country and I see different political candidates that aren't in that country. But there's a European dimension to Punta. There's a growing and meaningful American dimension to Punta. And on the continuum, I mean, does Punta have some Dubai type vibe? Well, sure it does, right? Like it's got the ocean, it's got the towers, it's a community that is unabashedly about creating a wonderful experience for people from across the world who have the desire and the means to participate. So that's a thing. You also get kind of the Uruguay profonde, like, sort of like the La France profonde of rural Uruguay. You go out to the estancias and you go out to the cattle operations, or even if you are fortunate enough, as I was, to be an invited guest in the world of the British school in Montevideo, that is a very localized, very deep, incredibly richly woven and networked culture. It's a lovely culture, and they can be very hospitable, but it's such a cohesive culture that if you're from the outside of it, at best you're going to be an honored outsider, which can be a very nice thing to be, but you're never going to assimilate past a certain point because it's such a cohesive culture and it's not your culture of origin. And that's a big decision for somebody moving to Uruguay, because when you're in Uruguay and you're outside the world of Punta, you're in a very cohesive and a very winsome culture with many wonderful attributes, but it's like you will always be an outsider. If you want to not be an outsider by virtue of being an outsider, you need to be up around Punta. It is what it is. It has pros and cons. I'll say something simple, like my rate of Spanish acquisition plummeted in the week I was in Punta because it was so easy to only speak English. And that, like if hanging out in Montevideo and working on my Spanish and taking the bus and going to local street fairs to get vegetables and extra clothing, if that's the equivalent of eating vegetables, then being up in Punta was like an all-you-can-eat buffet of Twinkies, right? I mean, for one meal, it's like super delicious, but maybe it's just too easy over the long term.
But maybe some other people don't look at it that way. They look at it in terms of, well, I feel comfortable here. I'm not required to assimilate. The bar for assimilation is much lower.
Right.
Fine by me.
And that is, I think you're absolutely right, Jason. And that's why I don't, because our family has not moved to Uruguay on a center mass full-time basis yet. It's not a decision we need to make yet. And that's a part of what we want to learn when we go back in November, is to get a little more clarity on do we want to be the accepted and token outsiders in a cohesive culture that is not our own? Or do we want to be components of an internationalized culture that has components of everything, but is deeply rooted in nothing? It's a question, and I don't have an easy answer to.
Well, it's very interesting, because if you take Japan, I think, because like you contrast Hong Kong with Japan, or Singapore with Japan, the level of English in Singapore is virtually native fluency. It's an official language. It's on every sign. Everyone, even if the level varies, it's above a passable threshold to get around, to conduct basic commerce. It means that very few expats learn Mandarin or Tamil or Malay because you're set up with English to begin with. Whereas Japan is different. English is not an official language. The expat expectation is that you will conduct business in Japanese. So just that one little, difference in threshold, it creates two totally different outcomes.
And maybe a nice thing about Uruguay for anyone thinking about it is because I remember this. I mean, there'd be days in Montevideo. There was one time where I was invited to be part of like a little small dinner for the Anglican Church in Montevideo. Notwithstanding that they're Anglican, this was Spanish language dinner. And for 2 to 2.5 hours, I was in full immersion mode, and I was racing the engine. My mind was going about 7,000 RPMs to capture 10 miles an hour worth of speed. And I got to the end, and people were so nice and so friendly. And I got back to my place where I was staying, and I was just exhausted. And then the very next day, I ended up having like a long lunch with this American expat family who'd grown up in a different part of Midwestern state where I live. And, we're just talking English and saw the same movies growing up. And it was so easy. And what's cool about Uruguay is, that Punta and Montevideo are only 2 hours apart. And the fact that you're immersed day to day in one, if you ever need a break and you've got to go to the other mode because you either want some vegetables or you want some Twinkies, then it's just a 2 hour drive. Like, it doesn't have to be a permanent all or nothing choice. I don't know. And that's also even true about neighborhoods in Montevideo. If you are hanging out in Ciudad Vieja, that's very different than if you're hanging out in Carrasco. So, even in one city, the degree of available English and degree of expat orientation really varies by neighborhood, and you can figure out what's right for you.
Well, so what's this sort of feel in terms of the paperwork burden being an expat in Uruguay? Like, in terms of, is it a place that you can plug into? Do they have a sort of interface for expats that's relatively easy to get started with?
I think that depends on your definition of easy. One man's easy is another man's difficult.
But based on a global standard, like if you took, I think Singapore has, they would pride themselves on being easy to plug into. It's not to say that they don't have a lot of rules, but they have day one, there are resources that a newcomer who's intending to start a business or, attain permanent residency. There's no shortage of literature. There's no shortage of sort of, people who can, helping hands, whether in the private or governmental sector, who can lead you along the way.
So here's how I'd answer that, Jay. That's a great question. And I cross-checked what I'm about to say with several other North American expats to make sure it wasn't just me. And that's a roundabout answer to your question, but it's an answer. The amount of my to-do list that I accomplished each day in Uruguay was less than my North American to-do list. And by the time I was a week and a half in, I began to wonder, like, am I lazy? Like, what's the issue? What's with my gap in productivity? And I talked to some other people who are from North America who are in Uruguay, and they're like, no, I've had the same thing happen to me. It's totally just the same. Stuff takes longer here. And that can be everything from they don't have Amazon in Uruguay, at least at any meaningful scale, or stores are not open at random hours of the day. I could go on, but it's not, I am not implying that it's some sort of mañana, Latin American, everybody's taking a siesta. It's not like that, but things are less tightly coupled, which means that they're less efficient under a narrow definition of efficiency. So it's very hard to do things in a tightly coupled, super fast, what we would feel from a G7 kind of, this is efficient. But the flip side of it is, it's actually pretty resilient. And when you're dealing with bank tellers, or you're dealing with, with bureaucrats or government people, you may not get what you want done exactly at that meeting, but there's not an ambient hostility where they're out to screw you over. So it's kind of like, well, we can't do that now, but come back 2 days from now. And they're not telling you we can't ever do it, F you. It's more like, no, like you're going to need to come back 2 days from now. And, what I discovered is that for instance, I left because I was tired and tit-witted and absent-minded. I left a book on my plane at Carrasco Airport. So I'm like halfway through the customs line and haven't gone through customs yet and realize I forgot my book. So I walk back through umpteen layers of security. I walk back up the jetway. I talk in very pidgin Spanish to the stewardesses who go look for the book, and they can't find it, but they take my information and name and so forth. And then 30 minutes later, I'm waiting in the custom line, and one of the stewardesses brings over my book. Like, when would that ever happen in the United States? It would never happen. Things are slower, but they eventually get done. And to your question of like, where is Uruguay on the welcoming expats or the arriving thing? I'd say no, there is not a highly developed, standardized kind of like, here's sort of your new employee orientation to the nation of Uruguay. If you're looking for something structured like that, you're not going to find it. But the flip side is, if you're just kind of nice and relational and polite and persistent, you'll be surprised by how things work out. And the government and the culture and the businesses and the people, they're not out to screw you. They're not out to trap you. They're surprisingly helpful. So if you just adjust your expectations, you're going to end up getting to a good place. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to be a little more direct with the question too is also in terms of the greasing the wheels, glad handing, in terms of the transparency index,
Yeah. So I'll address that, right? Like, I get
Yeah.
what you're getting at, right? It's, it's a Latin American country. So
Yeah.
people approaching it from a kind of European or North American context, there's going to be questions. And I'll tell you straightforwardly what my experience has been. It is very relational in Uruguay. It, the people all kind of know each other, or they know people in common, and they take time to nurture and focus on the relationship context when matters of business are happening. The first reflex we have, well, that must be shady. It must be corrupt. There's got to be bribes. There's got to be something under the table, yada, yada, yada. And I don't believe that's true. I believe it is simultaneously very relational and yet surprisingly not corrupt. And I would ask, like, for instance, the people at the rental counter when I rented a car, and they're like, hey, the speeding tickets are bad, the fines are high, be sure to obey the speed limit. And I'd ask them, I'm like, if I get pulled over, but by a cop, do I need to pay him a bribe? And like, they looked at me like I had three heads. They're like, no, you don't need to do that. It's a rules-based society with an expectation of decency and fairness. So the rules-based it's actually, in my experience, at least, unless there's some sort of there might be a latent underlayer of corruption that I'm too new to see and I'm too naive to realize is going on and is some nefarious high-level thing, maybe, but they're doing a pretty good job of concealing it if it's there. But the flip side of it is, there's an expectation of decency, which means it's a bad country to be a Karen. If you roll into a situation and you're going to Karen it, that is not going to go well for you. I hope that makes sense. I think, and it's possible that I'm oblivious and super naive, but I would describe it as extremely relational, yet surprisingly uncorrupt.
I think that's great news for people who are considering Uruguay, because I think that you'd want to have some baseline. I mean, I think there are some people, let's be honest, that are probably going out of their way. Like if you're Carlos Ghosn, right? In his decision matrix to become an expat, the very shadiness of Lebanon was a feature, not a bug, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, his other option was to go to France or Brazil. The guy's got like 3 or 4 passports. So I guess not to be an expat, but where would he relocate himself amidst potential Interpol, pressure, right? And for him, he was looking for a place that had intransparency. So I think for a reader base that is presumably looking for a higher degree of transparency, that's great news.
But the flip side of it is there's a lot of angst in Uruguay about opening bank accounts. And I don't think it's quite as hard as people make out. But on the other hand, I'm still working on opening mine.
Okay. So it's still pending. Did you attempt to open one?
Right. I did when I was down there, and it's progressing. It's progressing. There's every reason to think it, but it's not like something you can just walk in and walk out with your account number. So I don't really have credibility to talk about opening a bank account until I have a bank account in Uruguay, and I'm still working on it. But in the course of listening to people talk about that, the outcome and the process and the depth and the speed and the intensity of something as simple as doing that will vary by bank branch, and it will vary by the teller you work with. So that's the flip side of Uruguay. I don't believe it's corrupt, but I observe that outcomes are not uniform, and you can't exactly forecast what your outcome is going to be out of any particular attempt to do something. If you don't get it done right away, it's not sinister. They're not out to screw you.
Yeah.
You just need to take another bite at the apple and keep moving forward. And the good news is it's very human and it's very kind. But the flip side of that is it's not uniform, and any particular interaction is not necessarily predictable.
There's some downside to that, but if you hearken back to our first discussion, I think if you looked at it from an arbitrage lens, there could be something good to it too, right?
I think so. I think I'm very concerned about being unintentionally patronizing, and I don't want to do that. But I developed so much respect for how well and how fully and how happily people I ran into across all levels of wealth were living. And they were so efficient at sort of converting money into fulfillment and happiness and being worthwhile engaged in life. Very few of them were devoted to maximizing marginal economic productivity at all, right?
Mm.
So I would say that Uruguay just pursues a radically different optimization function than the United States does. And they're not maximizing for efficiency. They're not maximizing for wealth, but they do a pretty good job of maximizing for happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some dark sides to that, as the case study of like the young person I met who's flying off to Spain to get a job opportunity, and some other younger people I talked with. They're very candid. They are like, this is not a good place to get jobs. This is not a good place for opportunity. And people at all levels of society will say the salaries are too low and stuff costs too much. So there is a dark side. And when we have our expat privilege, which we earned money from the outside that we can spend in Uruguay, and we have our USD and we have our blue passports, like, it's easy for us to be oblivious to those downsides. And it's not good to be oblivious. And it was so interesting. Many people would ask me questions basically of, so why are you here? And it's a big world. And why the hell of all the places you could have chosen did you choose Uruguay? And I tried to answer that question honestly, but I also brought a lot of humility to it because, I don't know, I took something from that about global migration. For every batch of people looking to leave a country, there's another batch of people who are trying to get in. And people are at different stages in their lives. They're looking to optimize for different things. So you can have a really great country that's going to have just as many outflows as it does inflows. And it doesn't mean the country is bad. It just means that it doesn't match what somebody's optimization function is. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And it also begs the question that if we're talking about the magnet, right? The magnet, attracting you in terms of all of these features about Uruguay that we've talked about, and very, you've been really open and at the same time really analytical about why so many of them are attractive. But there is another side of the ledger too, which is the repulsion domestically, right? So maybe that's where this whole thing started, right? You've been open about that as the initial catalyst, right? So it was the repulsion, and then it turned out, the happy sort of side of the story is there's an attraction, but where is the repulsion standing now? Give us an update, for those of us who are outside the US, where are we at today? We're at war.
Yeah.
There's some really dark clouds brewing.
There are.
If I'm struggling to find strands of optimism, is there something wrong with me?
I don't think there's anything wrong with you. And I'm reluctant to answer your question, not because it doesn't have a clear and honest answer, but because I was having so much, I was so happy to have a temporary refuge from negativity. But you deserve an answer to your question. And I'm not particularly optimistic. It's a paradox. At the end of 25, I had a flare of optimism. I thought the regime was on the retreat, and that, maybe we were past the worst of it.
You quantified it with numbers.
Right. Gosh, if we're being exhaustive about it, the ICE thing has probably hit its high water mark. It hit its Pickett's charge in Minneapolis, and there were casualties associated with that, and it was a tragedy. But we're probably, and look, I mean, like that Border Patrol guy, Bovino, retired. Like he's, and Noam's out. So that's a defeat on the part of the administration. And then the tariffs are unconstitutional. And in election after election after election, by election, the Democrats keep monster outperforming their results from 2024. The people crossing partisan lines to vote on the Epstein files is, so you can find, if you want to enumerate specific data points that might be incrementally hopeful, one could. And the regime has very few people, very few talented people. It just doesn't have like the depth of HR bench to staff autocracy the way autocracy requires staffing. So it's a tyranny of memes. It's a tyranny of, of Twitter. It's performative tyranny that's trying to make up in light what it lacks in heat. Their ability for sustained throughput in the production of tyranny is kind of like their ability to do sustained precision fires from our missile stockpiles, right? Like they're not able to replenish their reserves of ammunition. So you can make all those arguments. But if you pivot and look at the other side, I am extremely concerned about the war. I haven't written much about the war on my Substack because I am dispositionally deeply respectful of our service members in uniform, and I don't want to take any cheap shots, and I don't want to glorify the Iranian regime. I think it's, on average over time, it's a net negative for its own people and the world. On the other hand, our administration is lawless. They are inept. They are foolish. The entire Greenland episode was pathetic. This war is illegal. It's being pursued in an unwise and unjust manner. I don't believe it's going to end well for the United States. It's a little lurid, but you could make the argument that the Strait of Hormuz is going to be Trump's Stalingrad. And we're all going to pay such an immense price. It's selfish to go to the investing dimension, but investors are going to pay a tremendous price. And obviously the lives that are being lost is the worst price of all. But I think if he goes taco on this, this is a situation that doesn't end when he goes taco. It is beyond his ability to control the timing by deciding when he goes taco. And I don't like any of the pathways that I see. And yeah, it was pretty bleak to be at the end of my time in Uruguay and kind of wake up that Saturday morning and the war was on and it was time for me to go back. I was very, very glad to return to my wife and son and my dog. But other than that, I did not want to go back. I Sorry, there's so many dimensions to take on your question. I wish,
No.
but no, I don't feel optimistic. And if you're asking, well, okay, tangibly, so where does that put you, Expat Prep? Are you staying or are you going? We're intentionally going to lean into the optionality. I am attempting to stack capital as fast as I can, both for expat and also for the AI menace that maybe this is the last 18 months that I'm ever earning an income. I mean, who knows whether those predictions are true. So I'm stacking capital. And, fortunately, there's a certain amount of it that's available to stack. So, like, it's kind of tempting to stay here and stack it. We're trying to lean hard into the second home thing. As far as Mrs. Expat Prep is surprisingly open to, like, if there were ways to go down and be there 1 or 2 years and immerse our son in school and have them pick up some Spanish, and it could somehow not be a one-way decision that would sort of, would permanently nuke our United States employability, then I think we'd both like to do that. So much rides on the midterms. I think probably there'll be some sort of shambolic, hyper-partisan, hyper-caustic, horrific version of 3 standard deviations of normal, and ultimately we'll get to the other side of that, and it will be savage and horrible and terrible and depressing and bleak, but we'll get to the other side. But if for some reason they don't happen or they're postponed or they're martial lawed or whatever, well, then we're leaving right away. So there's been very few times, and maybe no other times in my life, where I've felt as little agency over critical decisions in my life. Like, for instance, Expat Prep, where will you live 18 months from now? And I don't really have a clear answer to that question because my preferences are only a part of the equation. And the idea that a 79-and-a-half-year-old tyrannical, demented man who just needs to be put into a nursing home is the exogenous variable in these significant decisions in my life. I don't like that, but that's where we are. And I'm grateful because, as opposed to most other Americans, overwhelmingly most, we now have the choice. And I joke, so, end with a sardonic joke. Right now, we're on a month-to-month lease with the United States of America.
But you've got to retain your sense of humor, and you have no shortage of it.
I would make another observation, which is the flip side of the bad news of having the blue passport, which is the worldwide taxation, is that the decision about where they go and when they're there, unless you're trying to optimize the foreign earned income exclusion and you can't be in the US for more than 30 days, then it really doesn't matter. So that, at least removes what for your non-doms is a crushingly significant variable. Now when I'm like looking at Shahed drones, fly however slowly and awkwardly and lethally towards my luxury high-rise, I have fewer variables I need to optimize around on the exit decision. So,
in that sense, it's a silver lining, right? It certainly makes it takes that level of, I could see how there are some people who could be exposed in a way that they'd never imagined. right? There's the threat of bodily harm, but if you couple that, it can you imagine how heightened that decision would be, right? And the temptation to not pull the trigger.
The note that I posted a few days ago, and I have a couple of things percolating, just a little bit of writer's block, also Substack. There's so much content out there now. I've become more and more determined not to push any content that I'm not convinced is not only my best, but is extremely relevant and useful. And also on Expat Prep, we've kind of covered the canon, right? Like the core principles have been enunciated. So I chose some weeks ago that I was going to pivot away from the regular weekly publication, and still doing a lot of notes, going to get a bunch of original data and insight down in Uruguay, and we're going to be percolating that and pushing it out, which is to say, there is more in the pipeline. But one of those things is there was that New York Times article about the American physician who was marooned in, I think, Dubai on the way back from India or in Saudi Arabia or something in the Middle East. And he had to get back to New Orleans. And it was like 72 or 80 hours worth of travel. And it cost him every bit of $15,000. And it had him driving through the desert in Saudi Arabia from maybe Kuwait or Dubai or something. And he takes a flight to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and then eventually gets back to the United States, yada, yada. The State Department is, of course, doing nothing to help get him back to the United States at all. And it cost him way more than $10,000 to do this. So to your point that people's lives are getting very disrupted, I think the power of this episode is if you're going to be traveling internationally, if you're going to be living internationally, you need to do a lot of rigorous analysis about what your immediately available capital reserves are, because maybe the new threshold is if you don't have instant access to at least 15 grand, then you're not actually at a responsible way of traveling, because it's not easy to repatriate yourself and the government's not going to help you do it. I don't know. There's a lot on that case study.
There's a lot, and again, what is that threshold, right? As you put it, like, to define it as irresponsible if you're under that threshold is kind of a 2 weeks ago it'd be almost but 2 weeks ago it'd be a little bit Dr. Evilish,
Correct.
in a sense to say.
But the other, maybe the broader thing is that it just calls into clear relief how maybe in a way that's never been true in my life as a United States citizen up to now, and I'm pushing the half-century mark, yikes, the government not only is completely indifferent to your welfare, in many respects, the number one adverse malign actor in your ability to live and exist and travel and conduct business and to have a productive life is your own government. Like the number, the number one chaos agent, the number one bad actor, the number one causer of, of economic collapse and death and wanton destruction, coupled with, massive indifference to your welfare, is your own government. So to a degree that used to be characterized only by like certain kind of militia oriented dudes living in compounds in Idaho, right? They might be like, welcome to the party. We told you this in 1987. And that's a dark worldview, and I don't want to go there, but anyone who's a kind of a American other than Pete Hegseth right now, the honest lens of our own government is that on their best day, they're indifferent to your welfare. And on the other days, they are actively doing things to make you less safe and more poor. So you have to plan around your own government in a way that you never did before. Oh, and by the way, by Murphy's Law, pretty much every time I'm traveling internationally, there's a partial or a complete government shutdown, and like TSA and global entry are kind of completely foobarred. So, one can sit around and get angry about that, but that's not very useful. A more constructive thing is to accept that the government is a chaos agent and that they make things difficult and worse. And you just need to, like, I don't know, when the going gets tough, the tough turn pro. Like, accept that your government is shambolic and move on. That is, unless we do what you did, which is get on the other side of the planet. That's the end state to which we can all aspire. But for those of us that are not there yet, we have to go to plan B.
Well, shambolic is, yeah, it's a big word. You have such a deft way with innuendo and allegory. So I love how you use these words.
The goal, Jason, is to be as nasty to the people I'm describing as if I had dropped umpteen F bombs, but not swear and use words with enough syllables that only 30 seconds after I finish talking do they realize I said something mean.
Somehow I'm able to keep up enough to know the general direction. The general direction. But I mean, it comes down to, it's one of those things. It's like, yes, the U.S. Could send in, resources to help, stranded citizens in Dubai and Kuwait and Oman. But it's like, to me, it's just shocking, the level of abandon that we're seeing, and the fact that this operation was, it's like, did they even notify the service members? It was such a surprise attack, right?
Yeah.
Did the service members, it seems like it was only post hoc that they then were like, oh, okay, guys, just, this all happened really quick. Sorry about that. Now here's some cash. Go to a 4-star hotel, turn off the lights, hide so that the Shahed drones are mildly disrupted from finding you.
Right. And if we're talking about it, I encourage you, any listeners, go look at the work of a guy named Radigan Carter. It's not his actual name. He too is pseudonymous. He's some sort of kind of government agency guy, special forces adjacent, served some time in the Navy. I don't think he was a SEAL. He's a little oblique about what he did, but it's in that space. And he is a self-taught investor, and he publishes fascinating monthly commentaries from wherever he is in the world. And he's written a lot about what the Houthis did to us and to the Navy in the Red Sea, and how that was really effectively, the Houthis fought the United States Navy to a draw. And, we can act like that didn't happen, but that's kind of what happened. And the Red Sea is a much larger battle space with more freedom of navigation than the Strait of Hormuz. The Houthis have a lower level of military hardware available to them and much less quantity of it than the Iranians do. So if our full-on kind of undeclared naval war against the modern Barbary pirates of the Houthis, the best we could do is fight them to a draw. I don't understand why we think we're going to get a better result in the Strait of Hormuz. And, if I, as a middle-aged Midwestern tax lawyer, can get these insights, then surely our defense intellectuals must have had these insights available. And then you wonder, like, was anyone in the White House listening to the defense intellectuals? And I think the answer to that question sort of answers itself. I think we can see in how this thing is unfolding what the answer to that question was.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, it's not. There's no. Both questions to me are no-brainers, right? Obviously, the planning apparatus would have run through countless detailed, highly sophisticated scenarios, right, in their analysis. But that can be true with a civilian control of the military that is also out to lunch. That is not just out to lunch, is like Weekend at Bernie's out to lunch.
Right. And I've done a lot of systems theory in the past. Like, I've read the work of Joseph Tainter. his, so his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, fascinating. There's an economist over in Ireland who did some fascinating work about global supply chains. His name is David Korowitz. And all the systems theory stuff, it's a highbrow PhD level version of FAFO, where how often can you mess with a system before it breaks? And I feel as if there's a relentless desire on the part of this administration to see just how much they can damage the American and worldwide free enterprise system, and it still works. And it's fascinating but also horrifying to see this experiment going in real time. And I'm not optimistic about the result at all. But I have to keep living our life. We all have to keep living our life, right? And
yeah, absolutely.
I haven't gone all to cash. I think there's an impossible kind of market timing problem on the backside of that, of when you re-enter. And a lot of their policy choices could unleash a ripping amount of inflation. So cash is a very dangerous place to be. And I don't have any deep answers. I just stay really diversified, and I try to control my spending rate and to make myself as resilient as possible in the face of their persistent efforts to commit arson on my personal balance sheet, you know?
And I think that there is probably something therapeutic to the very act of planning itself, right?
Oh yes. That would be
That
fair.
even if it's just going out back and then taking a tin of tuna and looking at the date and then switching it with another tin of tuna with a later expiration date. There's something sort of Mr. Miyagi therapeutic about the act, about the zen of planning, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
maybe nothing comes of it, but the knowing your tools, knowing your exits, right? I mean, you've referenced the Bourne Identity, right? Thinking about, okay, I enter a room and what is the exit? Who am I dealing with in this situation?
Right.
This you could probably look at in terms of, these are rational responses to a crisis situation, right? We have to soothe ourselves through some type of, it may seem pointless in some ways, but we have to reject that, that's too much pessimism for us to deal with. We have to take on this planning as if it's almost something that is value creating.
It's almost like you're going to issues of existential responsibility. Like, it's a profoundly hopeful thing to operate perhaps under an illusion, but to operate as if we still have agency. That's actually a very hopeful thing to do. And I'm happier when I live my life as if I still get a vote in how it turns out. And that's what I think anyone reading my site I hope they'd go away with, which is that each of us still has significant residual agency, and a lot more than we might think we have. And if you use your agency wisely, then across a tremendous number of kind of potential states of the future, there's pathways to make your life better. And that's a more hopeful way to live. It's a more dignified way to live. It's a more satisfying way to live. And if you're doing this whole kind of building optionality the right way, rather than being fearful and pessimistic, it's actually very hopeful. And by the way, the entire preparations I'm making for international optionality, if the world turns out surprisingly to the upside, then in my early 60s, I'll just have a nice phase of early retirement where I'm spending 4 to 6 months a year at a beautiful place to live. Like, it's the exact opposite of a Cold War bunker. It's a lot more hopeful than that.
I love it. I love it. And I think that it gets at so many aspects of like we talked about that induction for somebody who's reading Expat Prep for the first time. I mean, I think it, like, I take issue with some of the people in the strict tax world who are advocating this hyper rationalistic view of how to conduct one's affairs, because at the end of the day, it's a lot of this stuff isn't rational. In my view, it's not. And I think, I've referenced Israel, a couple times, but I mean, I think, there's a certain resilience that comes from that surety. Like we can make judgments about a lot of different things, but I think one thing anyone will say about the Israelis is that they have this surety of purpose, right? And that's just, I would just posit that that's like one edge of the spectrum, right? Where it's just, you have this idea and it's like the ultimate resilience, right? Where you can weather so many different, transigencies, so many different events that pop up because you're sure about your purpose, And I certainly personally wouldn't take it. I'm not living a life where I'm doing that, I haven't committed to the monastery in Nepal to become a, full-fledged, monastic ascetic Buddhist, doing something like that. But I think that a strictly rationalist view seems to me really hollow. And I can't help but see these scenes in Dubai and think, oh my God, that must be a terrible, terrible situation to be. You have no conviction. There's zero resilience built into your setup that you put in there.
Yeah.
And I think what you're talking about with Uruguay, I think where we connect in our sort of stories is that I think we're trying to compose something that has a balance of both. We're trying to connect with a bigger purpose, but at the same time, we don't surrender some of these building blocks of, damn, we want good food. We want, a cool place to live. We want, a place that people are going to want to stop by. Is the airport, convenient, things like that. So the inductee into Expat Prep, my guess would be, as a reader of your stuff, like we're looking for some form of balance, and it's not, you can't find it in this hyper rationalistic matrix.
I think I don't disagree with what you're saying, and I won't name other Substacks by name. We could imagine what they are. They're well written. They do good work. They're optimized. They're helping people optimize for a different set of attributes. That's more kind of on the like, it might not be literally Dubai, but on the Dubai sort of optimization function. But I'm not a digital nomad. I may turn out to be an expatriate, but I don't conceptualize myself as a nomad. I enjoy being rooted. So, it's too bad that the United States has become so disrupted that now I'm contemplating becoming rooted somewhere else. But I guess I'd say that just as, that Uruguay contains multitudes, that our little corner of Substack likewise contains multitudes, and that's okay, because people are, they're coming to this set of questions with different life stories and different goals and different circumstances, and there's more than one way to do this. And some of the most interesting Substacks I read are people that I overlap some with, but not all with. They're doing it totally differently. They might live on a boat, like the Radical Path Substack, or there's John Howard's like Seeking Tranquility in France, or there's Benjamin Hees with the Digital Citizen. Those are three very different modes of being international. They're very different than my mode, but they're interesting. So to be a total wise ass, like, what was the quote from like the Cultural Revolution in China? To let 100 flowers bloom and 1,000 schools of thought contend. That's that's our corner of Substack, and that's okay.
I thought you were going to quote that revolution is not a dinner party.
Oh, well, that yeah, that's
But I'm with you with the 100 flowers bloom, the
I want to
multitudes.
speak to that revolution thing. I hope somebody reading my site, because we're living in times where maybe it's like modern version of John Brown at Harper's Ferry and the abolitionists, and in Bleeding Kansas, and at Charles Sumner getting caned by Preston Brooks. For people that are real American history geeks in mid 19th century American history, we know where it goes. It didn't go anywhere good. People are very morally charged and morally activated, and there's a lot of intensity out there. So, especially after what happened in Minneapolis. And someone might read my site and say, well, you're just chicken. You're not really willing to take a stand. You're ultimately bourgeois, etc. But I'd flip it around and I'd say maybe we're just focused on being decent. And in a world that doesn't have enough beauty and has too much pain, we're looking to make life a little more beautiful and a little less painful, and be the kind of people who are building a world and a way of life that is more worthwhile. And we try to leave the invective to others, leave the profanity to others, leave the nastiness to others, while still being honest about some of the profound governance deficits that are existing, right? We're going to be honest, but we're still trying to eventually this phase of nastiness will be over. And we're all going to have to live with who we were during this time. And we're going to have to live with each other when this time is over. And so we're trying to, at Expat Prep, I suppose, bring a cheerful decency to the act of resistance. And I don't think you have to surrender decency or even necessarily good cheer in order to be a person of integrity. Perhaps I'm naive, but maybe that's a uniquely kind of Episcopalian prep school view of the world, but that's my worldview.
That's a great place to end it. I think we can go back to your last note to 1861, Abraham Lincoln, mystic chords of memory, and the angels of our better nature.
Correct. And that the other part of that mystic chords of memory, it was an incredible speech, right? Lincoln was so amazing. But it goes on to say, will sound once again the chorus of the Union. And I like to think that in the midst of everything that's going on, somehow, some way, that will turn out to be true.
And that'll be the last word. So, Expat Prep, it's great to engage with someone with your experience, in intellect. Thank you for your time.
Well, you, sir, are a very gifted person, a true friend, and it's an honor to be back and to be invited back. And I am so glad that Substack and all its craziness has brought us together, and I cherish that we're going to be keeping in touch.